Hi, my name is Lorraine Watry and welcome to my studio. I am a watercolor artist and I've worked with watercolor for 26 years now, and I thought I would start a new series of videos where I go over different tips, tricks, and techniques for working with watercolor. And hopefully these short videos will help you in your journey, and if you have a question or a technique that you would like to see, please comment below and I will try to accommodate that in a future video. This video will be a continuation of the tip video number 22, where I talked about how I start a painting and the process that I go through to make sure that I have done all the background, basically getting set to do the painting. So I am continuing on with the different layers in this painting, and I have gone back to the clouds so that I can add some shadows to them. I decided to use cobalt and a little bit of Pearl Scarlet, which is a warm red, to create kind of a muted purple. And I placed some clear water on parts of the cloud just kind of randomly so that I would have hard and soft edges when I applied the paint. And I am going back in a few places and lifting just a little bit of that color before it had dried, so didn't want the whole cloud to be too dark because it wasn't a stormy sky, they were just with shadows. And now I'm going into some of the shadows or the background, I guess, color of some of the trees that are in the background. And I always work my paintings generally from lightest to darkest and from the background to the foreground. However, in this painting, because the landscape in the foreground is quite a bit of the painting, I wanted to get color on there first. And I am adding some texture in the grasses and getting an idea if I'm going to need to darken that whole area or if I can just start placing some color in a few places here and there. So the colors that I am using to create the grasses are cerulean with, I think, either New Gamboge or Quin Gold, or cobalt with those two yellows, New Gamboge or Quin Gold. And I'm using a variety of greens so that it makes it more interesting. I'm not trying to paint every blade of grass or foliage that is there. I'm just trying to give the viewer an idea that there are things growing there. In the background right, I use a cooler blue grass because in the distance generally things are going to have a little bit of a cooler feel to them, and so I want to change the color mix that I was using, and I believe I used cobalt with a little bit of Aureolin or New Gamboge to give myself a cooler green. Still making just a variety of marks, and I am not only creating the tops of the grasses or the foliage that's there, but I'm also creating a random edge at the bottom so that there is some interest at the bottom as well. And because this painting took many hours, it's not going to be a complete view of the whole painting, but snippets here and there, and it still ends up being about 35 or so minutes long. So if you want to see portions of the painting, you won't hurt my feelings. If you want to skip around and see how it goes and move it along even faster. There are some places in the background on the right that there are some deciduous trees growing, and so I used cobalt with a little bit of Aureolin, I believe, to make a cooler green, and I am leaving openings here and there to make it feel like there are masses of leaves with openings for the sky to peek through in places. And I work in layers for most of my paintings. So right now I'm not trying to get in the darker colors at this point. I'm just trying to get on base coats for a lot of the shapes that are in the painting and give myself an idea of the colors, and also just kind of separate things a little bit here and there. So I am kind of continuing to work around the painting and get layers on everywhere, and it does help to get color on and take away some of the white of the paper. I'm adding the background trees on that left side, and some of those are pine trees, so I'm using ultramarine blue and quin gold. It's one of my mixes that I really like for pine trees. And I left the trunks of the trees white, so I just painted around that. I did not mask those. They're easy enough to paint around. And now I'm going in and using a mix of cobalt and some burnt sienna to create the surface of the deck where it was a little more in light, and so it was a lighter gray. And then there are some places on the roof line where some of that same color, I could see that on some of the eaves and things like that as well. I am getting out some quin magenta and the burnt sienna, and I ended up starting the cabin with those two colors, and that mix kind of creates a little bit more of a rusty wood color, and I am painting down the front of the cabin at this point. As I get around the windows, I use some clear water to allow myself some area that if I don't have time to get into those areas completely then with the paint, then it will blur and create a soft edge. So in the center where you see the windows are a little lighter, the wood between the windows, that's because I added some water in those areas. The side of the roof line is darker, and so I added some ultramarine blue to the burnt sienna and quin magenta mix, and that starts to shadow that edge, or that side of the cabin, I should say. And then I move down to the deck line. And as I'm working on this cabin, I'm just basically kind of getting my feet wet in my process. So even though I did a lot of preparation for how I was going to do the painting and all of that, when you get into the actual painting, it still can be a little bit of trial and error, hopefully no error, but so I'm starting with a lighter version of the cabin color on pretty much everywhere, getting color down, and then I can go back and adjust and add layers. Right in there, I am painting the steps for the cabin, the shadow side of the steps, and so I'm using burnt sienna, quin magenta, and a little bit of ultramarine to give the darker shadow side to those steps. And then I go back and I use a little bit of water to fade the color in that I then paint around the lower portion of the windows, between the windows. Still using the burnt sienna and quin magenta mix, and I'm using, I believe I'm using my number 10 brush at this point because it is a small enough painting that I need a brush that's not as big as I normally would work with. My number 20 brush is sitting at the top of my palette there, and you can see the difference in size. And I believe I used the number 20 brush for the sky and for the land that's around the cabin. And I continue to get color in as a first coat everywhere, so this is a little darker on this side at this point, but it will not be, this will go darker on that side. Starting to get some of the shadow color in just a little bit on that side, and right there I realized that there was some masking fluid that I had applied, and somehow it had left a weird shape, and so I was able to pull that off. And I also realized later as I was working and then removed the masking fluid for around the windows that I had not painted it on as neatly as I thought I was, and so that's another, even though I thought I was painting it on carefully, it just wasn't quite as neat as I wanted it. There were edges that were a little too wide and some that were a little wobbly, and so masking fluid often needs to be adjusted, and I will go back later and make adjustments to it after I remove it. And right now I'm just adding some dark. So that dark on the side of the cabin, when I paint it on, it does look darker than what it is when it dries. Watercolor dries 20 to 30% lighter than how it ends up, and so that did add a little more color later on. It looks pretty dark right now, but it will be adjusted. So I'm pulling out some burnt sienna, some quin magenta, and some ultramarine blue. And I started in by placing a shadow on the front of the cabin to see if it was as dark as I want it, or if the cabin was as dark as I want it. And I decided that the base coat that's on the cabin itself would need to go darker. And eventually I do paint, I might even be doing it here. Yes, I'm painting the base coat on the cabin itself as a darker color. And part of it also was I was making sure I liked the color mix I was using. And I did end up pulling out some Quin Burnt Scarlet to add to the front of the cabin eventually, so that it would have a little bit of a kind of a rustier red look to it. So as you can see right now, my focus is on the cabin, and for some paintings, as I'm working on them, I get to a point where I will stop working and painting kind of things everywhere, and I will focus on an area. And so for now, this was one, capturing my attention, but also sometimes you get focused on working on some area, and it helps just to remain working on that area, because you kind of get a groove going with it, basically. And so this was working for me right now, and so I just kept working with it. I used some ultramarine turquoise at the roof for the roof line, and I really liked that color. It really matched what I was seeing in the image, and has that tin roof look. Right here, I added some clear water to the sky, and then I added some cobalt at the roof line, because there was a part of the sky right there that was a little bit too close in value to the roof, and so I wanted to make the sky a little bit darker so that the roof line would appear lighter. So don't feel like you can't go back and make adjustments to areas. So even though I felt like the sky was pretty well done, I decided to add that. I'm going in to add some shadow to the under part of the deck at this point. And I believe I used ultramarine blue, quin magenta, and maybe a touch of either quin gold or burnt sienna to make kind of a dark purpley color that was a little muted. And here I decide to use quin magenta and ultramarine for the windows. I started with a light color on parts that looked like they were reflecting the clouds, and then I went a little darker for the more shadowed parts of the windows. And I added, so I used the quin magenta and ultramarine with a touch of burnt sienna in it for those more shadow areas of the windows. And I could have painted these wet and wet. I could have got placed water on each square, but because they were small enough, I just started with the lightest part of the window and then added the darker parts next to that light area. So this was just painted on dry paper, but you could do it wet and wet. And at this point, I can really start to see that the masking fluid is going to be too wide in places and has some edges that are not very neat. So if you're working on your painting and it's been a while since you got up and got away from it, it's a really good idea to take a break and then come back and look at it with a fresh view, because oftentimes we get so focused on what we're doing that maybe we're not seeing if there's values that we need to adjust, or maybe something needs a different color, that kind of thing. And so even though it looks like I'm continuously painting, I do take breaks and I'll do other things. I'll often carry the painting around with me and look at it from across the room, because that long distance view can help you to see things that you might not when you're focused right at your painting. So looking at your painting in a mirror or turning it upside down can also help you see if something is not working in the values or in the colors. Here on the right-hand side, I'm going back into those deciduous trees that are on that side and adding some shadow, and a little more layering to it will add texture and give it more interest. And I used cobalt and I believe some aureolin in that area. And maybe a little bit of new gamboge as well to have a variety of greens. Still kind of keeping it lighter though, because I don't want it as dark as the photograph is for some of those background trees, because I want them to have a little more distance feel to them. And the atmosphere between the viewer and those background trees would add the, or basically make them feel lighter. And then I go into the evergreens a little bit in that area on the right, and I'm using ultramarine and quin gold, and then I also tried phthalo blue and some burnt sienna to give a little different look on one of the other evergreens back in that area. The value, the depth of or the darker value of those trees helps separate the background trees from the foreground landscape as well. So having that go a little darker down at the bottom was really helpful. And I did get away from the cabin for a little bit, and now as I'm looking at it again, it has dried, and I can see that my value on the cabin itself, and a little bit also the color, I wanted to increase the kind of warm red, warm brown feeling of the cabin, and so I went back and added some more layers to it. So you can see it's a process of working around the painting. And I did darken up in the upper edge of the roof line on the right, and I used some ultramarine blue with the burnt sienna, I believe, up there to darken. I am going in between the deck railing now to separate those from the cabin a little bit more, and I start looking for shadows on those railings so that I can help give them a little bit of form. There are some green from the trees in the background peeking through some of the rails on that side, so some of that will be in the greener mix. The boards on the right side of the building and the deck area kind of blend together in the shadow area. So once I got enough color on there for the first layers, I wasn't as worried about separating each rail or each board from the shadow side of that area. So it kind of helps to focus you on the front of the building as well, to have those shadows sort of blur, or not blur, but blend together with some of the other values around. And right now the windows on that side of the house don't have any color on them, so they look really bright. I decided to go back and add some more color into the windows, and I added, this time I used Alvaro's Fresco Gray, which is a Daniel Smith kind of purpley gray color, and that color worked really well to just go over the windows and darken them. I'm continuing to add layers, as you can see, to those background trees to get them to where I want. And I have gone back into the ultramarine and quin gold to add in another tree on that side. And then on the large tree on the left, I decided to use my green Apatite Genuine with some ultramarine deep. And the green Apatite Genuine is very granular. It's very kind of olivey green, and I really like it for evergreens. And then in a few places I might, I think I used a little bit of quin gold with the ultramarine deep as well. And I am leaving openings for the sky to peek through, and that also gives the feeling of branches and the needles. And I'm just painting down the tree basically as I work with the color. And so I'm painting around the trunk as I go, and not trying to make the tree too perfect. It had a little bit of some asymmetrical look to the branches. Now I'm working in the lower right with the small evergreen that's in that corner, and this evergreen doesn't show up on the photo that I'm working from, but it was in another photo, and I wanted to add that in to give a little more depth to the scene. So having that evergreen in the foreground there, and then some of these rocks, helps give scale to the cabin and also gives depth to the scene. I'm using a mix of some browns and some grays on the rocks, and I am making sure that I keep the bottom edge a little random so that it feels like there's grasses and things growing up next to the rocks. And now I'm getting toward the end of the painting, but there are still some things that I will need to adjust. I now pretty much have color everywhere, and I am going back into the tree to add some branches and put the trunk on the tree and some of the other trees in the background. Now I go back into the grass area because I can tell with some of the other detail in other areas that I want a little more detail in that area too. And it is a fine line between painting every blade and not painting enough. So just adding a little bit here and there and getting an idea if I want to add more. This area of the painting, I am now placing some of the shadows on some of the boards that make up the cabin, and that helps give texture to the cabin and make it more interesting as well. I still have not removed the mask around the windows at this point, and that is because I was still making adjustments to everything, and I usually wait to remove mask until I feel like I've done enough that if I need to make a change, it won't matter if I remove the masking fluid at that point. This is a rubber cement pickup tool, and I have now pulled off the masking fluid everywhere, and I usually run my hand over the painting to make sure that I've removed it, and I know that I'm going to have to go back in and add color to the windows so that I can make the frames of the windows smaller and clean up the edges of the masked area. So I will slowly go through the process of cleaning each of the lines, and this took quite a bit of time, and I won't show it all, but basically I go through and I clean it all up, and then I add shadows to some of the frames of the windows where it is in shadow. And I do turn my painting every now and then as well to make sure that I'm getting the angle to get nice clean lines, and I'm using probably a number 4 brush. So small brush and getting more into the details. So before this, I was painting a lot of layers and all of that, and not using small brushes. And I wait to use my small brush until I get into the smaller things, the details. So I hope this process was helpful to see and to see me walk through the painting. If you didn't catch the first video, tip video number 22, where I talk about the start of the painting and how I go about getting ready to do a painting, that would be a really good thing for you to watch. And if you have any suggestions for a future tip and trick video, if you have a question about something to do with watercolor, please comment below. And if you will subscribe and like and share these on all of your social media, that helps get these videos out for others to see. I do already have some videos from prior questions that others have asked to see, and so I have those in the queue, and I will be getting those out in the following weeks. So I hope you have a good day, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.